Okay, hello and good morning or good evening wherever you are, and welcome to all of those who have joined us for this online briefing today. My name is Susanna Elliott from the Australian Science Media Centre. And before we go ahead, I'd just like to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Kaurna people here in Adelaide, and very much appreciate their strong cultural connection to the land, waters and culture of this region. Now, I just want to say that normally this would be Lyndall Byford running this briefing, but we have had a massive storm overnight and lots of us have lost power and our internets are out, but mine is okay and Ben's is okay. So we're going to go ahead and just hope that everything works smoothly. Now, this briefing is under embargo, as I'm sure most of you know, and that embargo lifts at 1 minute past midnight tomorrow morning. That's Tuesday, the 21st of March. So, of course, we're here to talk about the latest IPCC synthesis report, which just came together over the weekend. And I think the embargoed copy just came out very early this morning. So I don't know if anyone's had the chance to look at that, but hopefully you'll get the chance to see it during the day. So this is the Climate Change 2023 Synthesis Report, and it's the most comprehensive summary of our current knowledge of climate change. And today we have 3 Australian members of the report's writing team, which is incredibly lucky. And I have to say that they've all come from various places. They've come from, some have just flown in from Europe, others are just about to get flights. So it's all an interesting morning. So first of all, we have Professor Mark Howden, who is Director of the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions at the Australian National University, and of course a member of the IPCC Synthesis Report core writing team. Then we will have Professor Malte Meinshausen, who is Professor in Climate Science at the University of Melbourne and a member of the IPCC Synthesis Report core writing team also. And then hopefully we will have Professor Frank Jotzo, who's Director of the Centre for Climate, Economics and Policy and Head of Energy at the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions at the Australian National University, and he's also a member of the IPCC Synthesis Report core writing team. There will be an opportunity to ask questions of our speakers at the end of their presentations, and you can do this by typing your question into the Q&A box or raising your hand and we will unmute you. You can actually put your question into the Q&A box at any time you like, but we won't take the questions until after the presentations. So we will hand over and start with you, Mark. Thank you very much.
Hi, Susanna, and thanks very much for your introduction there. And probably just to clarify, I'm actually a vice chair of the Working Group II of the IPCC, and I was a review editor on the synthesis report. But that's all fine. So I guess I can just give some brief sort of introductory comments, a little bit about the IPCC, the nature of this report, and some elements about the I guess the climate science coverage within this report, and then Malte and Frank can deal with some of the other issues, and then I can perhaps come back to dealing with some of the adaptation issues. But as you rightly point out, this is a synthesis report. It brings together the previous 6 reports from the IPCC, 3 special reports and 3 large assessments. And what it tries to do is it tries to both summarize and synthesize that information across those different reports. So it is, in a sense, limited by what's already in those previous reports, but it tries to do some new things with the information in those reports by putting it together in a slightly different way. So one of the core messages coming out of this synthesis report is it confirms that humans are unequivocally increasing our greenhouse gas emissions, which is leading to increased and record greenhouse gas concentrations in our atmosphere, which is increasing the global temperature. We're now 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial, and that's driven widespread, rapid and very substantial changes right across the globe in things like sea level rise, in terms of climate extremes, in terms of food productivity, agricultural productivity. And that largely has actually been problematic. So the impacts on balance tend to be negative rather than positive. And so that's actually generated widespread and problematic impacts to lives, to livelihoods, and to natural systems. And it's very clear that, and increasingly clear, that vulnerable people who've often contributed least to the greenhouse gas emissions are disproportionately affected by these climate change impacts. They are also, as well as those differences across different geographies and different financial statuses, there's also intergenerational equities which are highlighted in this report. So, for example, a child born now is likely on average to have or experience 3 to 4 times as many extreme climate events in their lifetime as their grandparents did. So we're actually leaving a world behind us that is actually less safe than the world which we inherited, people of my generation. So I could perhaps just leave that there as an introduction, but I could also move towards some comments on adaptation as well before Malte. So I'll leave that up to you, Susanna, to make that call.
Look, I think if you could make a few comments, short comments, that would be terrific, Mark. Go ahead.
Okay. So clearly what we're already seeing is very substantial impacts across the globe. And not surprisingly, people have been starting to adapt to those impacts. So they're actually starting to do things differently to actually absorb some of the risk and in some circumstances take advantage of the changes. So what we're observing is that adaptation planning and implementation has progressed. So we're seeing a lot more of it. And there are good examples of how sometimes it's been quite successful and how it also can bring co-benefits. So you get, as well as the climate change adaptation benefits, you can get other benefits that improve human well-being or improve biodiversity outcomes. So one example of that would be if you see increasing flood risk in our flood-prone areas, and you move people off those flood-prone areas and move infrastructure off those flood-prone areas, and instead put nature-based systems into those flood areas, that actually can reduce flood risk, reduce flood damage, increase biodiversity, and also store significant carbon in the soils and vegetation in those flooded areas because it's a high productivity area in most cases. So that's an example where a climate change adaptation can bring multiple benefits in different ways. However, when we actually look across the spectrum of adaptation responses, we see that increasingly clear that those responses are fragmented. They're often incremental in their nature. They're often very sector specific. They're unequally distributed across regions and of varying effectiveness. So we're not really on top of the adaptation game at the moment. And importantly, adaptation generally has not been at sufficient pace and scale to keep up with the pace and degree of increasing climate change impacts. So there's a widening adaptation gap, which is identified in this report, which needs to be closed, which we need to address. And one of the key messages coming out of this report, I think, is that there is actually hope here. So whilst there's concern, which I've just outlined, there is hope both in terms of the emission reduction side of things, and Frank and Malte will talk about that, but also in terms of adaptation. So we actually know a lot about how to deal with these changing risks and often increasing risks. And so we are in a position where we can actually remove at least some of the sting of climate change. And so, but there are well-known barriers to actually doing that, which we're actually observing, but there's also well-known ways of addressing those barriers. So that includes things like effective research and development in terms of climate adaptation, putting in place appropriate planning and policy mechanisms, and appropriate finance to actually support people who otherwise couldn't adapt to climate change. So I think we, amidst all of those messages of increasing risk, I think there needs to be also a message of increasing capacity to deal with this if we choose to do so.